Okay, I think we're live for another great session. Welcome back, everyone. The next session is about mastering the counter-conventional mindsets of entrepreneur. I'm very excited about this session because I think it's a little different than the typical sessions that we have at the CDOIQ Symposium. So we are lucky to have John Mullins with us to tell us about entrepreneurs. So John, over to you.
Thank you so much, JP, and welcome everybody. As chief data officers, you're often the people who can spot new opportunities, perhaps worthy of pursuit in your companies. But of course, as you well know, getting elephants to dance is often not an easy thing, and that's kind of like getting companies to be more entrepreneurial. So you don't need me to tell you that, of course. You work in companies that sometimes have trouble being as entrepreneurial as the leadership would like. So that's the challenge we're going to address here in the next hour or so. And I want to start with a story. It's a story about a remarkable woman, a woman who is a graphic design teacher in California, who in 1995 launched a website called lynda.com. She wanted to use her website as sort of a sandbox where she could play with the new digital design tools that were then being developed, use it as a repository where she could put stuff for her students. And before long, lynda.com became one of the top 100 websites in the world. Lynda was on her way to becoming what I call the poster child of these counter-conventional mindsets that enable entrepreneurs to do what they do so well. So why do I call Lynda and other entrepreneurs counter-conventional? Well, number one, many of her actions ran counter to the conventional practices found in big companies, probably like your companies. And second, they fly in the face of what we teach in business schools like mine at London Business School about strategy, about finance, about risk, and about a whole lot more. So you might ask me, John, well, what's a mindset? Well, here's what a mindset is. It's up here, of course, right? It's a mindset. A mindset is the collection of beliefs and thoughts that make up our attitudes, our habits, the way we are inclined to do things. And those mindsets actually predetermine how we respond to things that come our way. They might be events or circumstances or situations, or as we call them in the entrepreneurial world, opportunities. So it's these mindsets that predetermine how entrepreneurs respond to what they come today. And what I want to do is walk you through the 6 of these and then tell you how Lynda exemplifies these 6 mindsets. So the first of them is what I call yes, we can. So some of you may have been to business schools, and in B School Strategy 101, you probably learned that big companies are supposed to stick to their knitting, right? They're supposed to understand their core competencies, embrace them, make them more robust, invest in them. And if somebody comes along and says, gee, could you do something else? What are you supposed to say? Well, you're supposed to say, no, we don't do that around here. We stick to our knitting in this company. Okay, so that's big company B School Strategy 101. But for an entrepreneur like Arnold Correa in Sao Paulo, Brazil, that's now not at all how Arnold Correa thinks and acts. Arnold had started a very interesting business as a college student. He was creating these wonderful Sunday parties that they call domingueiras in Portuguese, Sunday parties for young people with light shows and music and dancing and lots of fun. And when he finished college, he said, you know, I've gotten pretty good at managing events. I wonder if I could do events for big businesses. So he put a little ad in a newspaper in Sao Paulo, and McDonald's called and said, Arnold, we have an event coming up, and we'd like you to manage it. And so he did. Well, very interestingly, not very long after that, there was another event for Walmart, who had become one of Arnold's clients. And the guy who was supposed to video the event called and canceled. And so Walmart called Arnold and said, Arnold, can you do that? Can you do the video? And what did Arnold say? Yeah, we can do that. Of course, Arnold had never shot a video in his life, had no video equipment, knew nothing about shooting or editing video, but he got on the phone, found somebody to do it, and reinvented his business. He was now in not only the event management business, but also the event production business. Well, over the next several years, Arnold would go on to reinvent his business multiple times. Each time when a customer called and said, "Could you do something?" Arnold said, "Yeah, we can do that," without regard to the competencies he already had, right? So the next big change was what he called a move into corporate TV. Walmart was one of his big customers, but he didn't have a very big share of wallet doing events for Walmart. And he said, "I'd like to do more." So he went to the US and he took a look at what Walmart was doing in the US. And they had televisions in the training rooms of all their stores in the US so that the senior execs could broadcast sales training, motivational events, and the like directly to the people in the stores, right? Break down the communication channels. Well, Arnold came back to Sao Paulo and said, "Gee, we could do that for Walmart." Now, it turned out that in order to do that, in those days, the internet in Brazil was not satisfactory. So he had to learn about and get access to satellite transmission technology. He had to install hardware and software all over Brazil, a far-flung country, where he'd only done that in Sao Paulo before. Lots of new competencies he needed, but he got it done. Well, the next big step happened right after the financial crisis, when Arnold realized that when you're in a financial crisis, companies cut their budgets. We all know that, right? Well, what they cut is the cost side of things. And Arnold said, I'm on the cost side of my customers' P&L. I don't want to be there. I want to be on the revenue side of the P&L. How could I do that? So he went back to the US, took a look around. And again, Walmart was putting televisions in the sales area of the stores so that when a customer walked down the detergent aisle, for example, they'd see a television, which part of the time might have a commercial for Procter & Gamble's TV. Other parts of the time, it might be a cell phone provider, a credit card company, or some Walmart content. So he came back to Sao Paulo, but did something interesting. He prepared a proposal for Walmart, but he gave the proposal to another of his clients, an appliance chain called Magazine Luiza, and the CEO of that appliance chain said, "Arnold, why are you doing this for Walmart? Do it for me." Again, the customer wanted it done. Arnold said, "Yes, we can." But again, new challenges, new opportunities, and new capabilities required. So entrepreneurs, when they get asked by a customer or see an opportunity to serve a customer in a new way, they say, "Yes, we can." And then they figure out how. So that's the first of these 6 counter-conventional mindsets. The second one I call problem first, not product first logic. Now, let's think about the conventional big company wisdom, right? They're all about their products. So if you think about Coca-Cola, for example, for a long time, there was only one Coca-Cola, of course. Then there was New Coke. Well, that didn't work out too well. Then there was Diet Coke. We now have Coke Zero, lots of flavored Cokes. There was a Coke Natural in a green bottle in the UK that was tested a while ago. That one didn't work out very well. But all of these are just little tweaks of the product, right? Take the detergent category, Tide. When I'm in the US, my family and I have used Tide for many, many years. And we always laugh when we see a new brand manager come on board, because we can tell, because they tweak the product. So they take the blue speckles out of the Tide and they put in green ones. And they call it new improved. They change the scent from Sea Breeze to Mountain Fresh or whatever, and they call it new improved. Now they have Tide with liquid in it, water in it, so it pours. Is this innovation, guys? I don't think so. So I want to tell you about an entrepreneur named Jonathan Thorne, who developed a very interesting technology that was applied to the device you see on your screen, which is a surgical forceps, an electrosurgical forceps. So this is the tool that many surgeons use to do their craft. Well, surgical forceps, before John came along, had a problem attached to them. they would stick to human tissue. And that was frustrating for the doctors, of course, the surgeons, but it also slowed down their work, which deterred their productivity. And John said, well, I've developed this new technology. It's a silver nickel alloy that he could apply to surgical instruments like forceps. And he said, well, what surgical specialty really has a big problem that I could solve here? Well, he decided the first target market should be plastic surgeons. And the reason he chose plastic surgeons was, number one, plastic surgeons work typically in their own clinics, so they are the decision maker. So much less bureaucracy to wade through to get a sale. And number two, when the plastic surgeon is finishing up the work, let's say a facelift, they don't want the tissue to stick to the forceps, right? Because if the tissue sticks, it might mar the final appearance. So John's reasoning was that's the place to start. Well, that did get him started, but then he realized a bit later that neurosurgeons had a much bigger problem that John could solve. So imagine you or I are having brain surgery. They found a little tumor in our brain and they've got to get it out of there. Well, we'd like them to get that tumor out of there, but we don't want them taking any other brain cells out of there, right? We kind of want to keep our brain cells as many as we can. So John switched his focus to neurosurgeons. The business took off, and some years later, John sold the business to Stryker, a big medical instruments company based in the UK. And John and all of his investors are, needless to say, very, very happy. But why did that happen? It happened because John's focus was on his customers' problems and not so much on his product. Okay, that's two. The third one, I call it think narrow, not broad. And what I'm talking about is when we think about our product markets here. So in big companies, when there's some new market that somebody wants to pursue, it's got to be a big one, right? Big companies don't want to mess around with small markets. And then secondly, when there's a new product, that product has to have enough potential to, as they say, move the needle. But for entrepreneurs like Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman, that didn't matter, right? So Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman, back at the beginning of Nike, were in the running game. Bill Bowerman was Phil Knight's track coach, and Knight was a just graduated MBA student from Stanford. And the two of them had figured out that the running shoes that distance runners wore weren't the right running shoes. The problem was that the European running shoes, which is what everybody wore at the time, were designed for sprinters, and sprinters trained by running around tracks. Well, that's not what distance runners do. We might have some distance runners in the audience here. You don't run around a track when you train. You run on dirt roads and country paths, and you step on rocks and sticks and maybe some rodent holes. And so distance runners were prone to getting shin splints from all the miles and miles of pounding. And they were prone to ankle sprains because of all the things they stepped on. So not only did distance runners have a problem, just like John Thorne in the mindset I just talked with you about, but there was also a very, very narrow target market they decided to target. That was the market of elite distance runners. That is people who could run nearly a 4-minute mile. Well, I don't know about you, but there aren't very many elite 4-minute mile distance runners, but that's where they started. But here's what happened. Once you get started in a narrow target market, you begin to learn some things. So what did the Nike guys learn? Well, they learned how to design shoes to meet specific athletes' needs in a targeted way. The second thing they learned is how to get shoes made and imported from Asia and brought to the US. And the third thing they learned is how to get elite athletes to endorse and help market their products. Well, needless to say, we know the rest of the Nike story, right? Once they had done shoes for elite distance runners, and those runners started winning medals, who else wanted to wear Nike shoes? Well, everybody who ran wanted to wear a Nike shoe. And then once they had mastered that wider market of more runners, then it was pretty easy to go to John McEnroe and say, let's do tennis. And then Michael Jordan, let's do basketball, and so on. And so the rest of the Nike story is clear, but it didn't start by targeting a huge market, which is what big companies like to think about. It started by targeting a very narrow, not a broad target market. Okay, the next one. I call it ask for the cash and ride the float. So today in many big companies, perhaps yours, they're awash in cash, right? So Merck in 2018, for example, spent 18 billion US dollars on stock buybacks and dividends, and they only spent 10 billion on R&D. What's wrong here, guys? Is that all they could find that's worthy of investment? Well, small companies, entrepreneurs don't think like that. Elon Musk joined the Tesla team early on. There were some existing Tesla founders. They convinced Musk to get on the bus. And Musk came on board, and the vision was quite clear for what Tesla was going to do. We're going to build a really fancy small sports car, but not very many of them. We're going to use the proceeds from that to build a somewhat lower price car, and we're going to use the proceeds of that to then build a more mass market car. So that was the vision going forward. So Musk came on board and he said, guys, let's see if we can sell some cars. They hadn't built any yet, but let's see if we can sell some cars. They did a little roadshow in California, to which they invited people with a few characteristics. Number one, they were wealthy. Number two, they were environmentally conscious and would appreciate an electric vehicle. And number three, they were the kind of people who would like to have a status symbol parked in front of their garage. Well, guess what? In 3 weeks, Tesla sold 100 Tesla Roadsters. None of them had been built yet. 100 Tesla Roadsters for $100,000 a piece in cash on the barrelhead tonight. Do the math, guys. That's 10 million US dollars in the bank, in cash, ready to start building out the first of the Roadsters. Well, that pattern is what has driven Tesla throughout its journey. There's a common misconception that Tesla is fundamentally funded by venture capital investors. And to some extent, that's true. They did raise some VC early on, but they haven't raised any since 2019. But most of the VC they actually raised was from Musk himself. But to get back to this ask for the cash story, fast forward to when they introduced the Model 3 several years ago, finally the mass market car. Guess how many people signed up to buy a Model 3? Almost 500 million customers. I'm sorry, 500,000 customers signed up, put their name on a waiting list to get their hands on a Model 3, and they paid $1,000 down to do so. Let's do that math. $1,000 times 500,000 car buyers. That's $500 million US dollars in the bank, in cash, with which they could then do the engineering, build the tooling, get the production line rolling, and produce the first Model 3s. So Musk builds his businesses, all of them actually, by asking the customer to pay up front and then using the float from those deposits up front to do everything else that has to be done to build a business. Okay, next one. I call it beg, borrow, but please don't steal. So in Finance 101, again, for those who went to business schools, we teach our students that when you want to do a new product, you got to invest, right? Whatever the project is, you got to invest. You look at your cash flows and you see what those cash flows are going to be in the future, and then you discount them back to determine what the return on investment is for this proposed new project, and is that ROI sufficient considering the risk. That's B School Finance 101. But for entrepreneurs, nah, they don't think like that. So there's a wonderful company in the UK called Go Ape that operates treetop adventure business all over the UK. Well, Tristram Mayhew and his wife Rebecca Mayhew came across a treetop adventure site on a vacation in France and said, you know, we could do this in the UK. But they said, we need some things to do this. And in particular, what we need is some forest land with really good trees. Well, it turned out in the UK, there's something called the Forestry Commission that manages a lot of the open land in the UK. So Tris and Bex went to the Forestry Commission and said, guys, you've got all these sites, 30 some sites all across the UK with wonderful woodlands and parking lots and visitor centers and all that stuff. And they said, we know you'd like to increase your visitor count. We've got a way we think we can help you do that, but we need to borrow your trees. So they struck a deal with the Forestry Commission that was as follows. If you can build 6 sites and get them open in the first 5 years, the Forestry Commission said, we will give you an exclusive on the rest of our sites that will last 25 years. So Tris and Bex were up and running. Today, if you go perhaps on a vacation to the UK, you'll find these sites all over the UK. There are more than 30 of them. There are a whole bunch in the US now too. There are Tarzan swings, rope ladders, all kinds of fun stuff to play in the trees. But how did they get it started? By borrowing the trees. And by the way, they borrowed the parking lots and the loos and all that stuff. They didn't have to invest in them. So what happened is when they would open a new site, that site would generate enough cash in its first 2 years to open one more site. Really nice growth funded by borrowing the assets, the trees, the loos, the parking lots up front. Okay, and there's one more, a 6th mindset that's all about permission. Well, in big companies, there are armies of lawyers, of course. If you want to do something really new, something really innovative, it's going to take a long time to get to yes in most big companies. And there are a lot of people who can say no. But for entrepreneurs like Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp, who started Uber, permission was not in the lexicon, right? Had Kalanick gone to the regulators in San Francisco and said, what would you think about us opening a business that's going to be kind of like a taxi cab business, but it doesn't have any taxis? We're going to just bring together a marketplace of people with cars and people who want rides. Well, we don't know, of course, what would have happened had they asked that permission. But my guess is, same as your guess, nothing would have happened, right? And we might not even have Uber and Grab and Kareem and all the originators, imitators around the world today. We might not even have a gig economy today. So entrepreneurs don't ask permission when the regulatory circumstances are ambiguous or unclear. They get going, and if necessary, somewhat later, they'll ask forgiveness. But by that time, they've got a whole bunch of customers on board who are rabid enthusiasts, as they were with Uber, and the regulators aren't going to shut them down. Now, I want to be clear here that I'm not talking about breaking the law. I'm talking about circumstances where the law is unclear or ambiguous. The laws in San Francisco, the regulations, had not contemplated an Uber-like solution in the taxi business. And so the laws were ambiguous, and off they went. Don't ask permission if you're an entrepreneur. Don't break the law if the law says no. And there's a great story I could tell you, but I won't, about a business that broke the law and didn't do very well. So I don't condone everything that Uber did along its journey. They did some things that were very clearly unethical, perhaps illegal. But by not asking permission, they brought a whole new category of transportation to the world that didn't exist before. Okay, so I started with the story of Linda Weinman, just a bit of that story. And you might say, well, John, why did you start with Linda? Why is she the poster child for these counter-conventional mindsets? Well, here's the rest of Linda's story. She was teaching graphic arts and graphic design at the Art College of Pasadena in California. And a guy named William Shatner came along and said, Linda, could you digitally render the Starship Enterprise for my new movie called Star Wars? And what do you think Linda said? Yeah, I could do that. She had no idea how to do that. She'd never done it before. She didn't have the competencies in place, but with the help of Mac user groups and a lot of experimentation, she figured out how, and she got the job done. So Linda didn't say, no, I'm just a teacher. I can't do that. She said, of course, yes, I can. In her teaching role, Linda's passion was all about getting her students to learn about how the new digitally powered web design tools could be used, Photoshop, Illustrator, and so on, right? And she developed a hands-on pedagogy where people would actually use the tools, not just talk about or listen to her explaining how to use the tools, but they would sit down at a PC and use the tools. That hands-on pedagogy made learning of these newfangled tools very easy. And she didn't think about providing that for just everybody. She said, well, who's the target market that I should serve here? And who should I teach Photoshop and Illustrator? Well, I'm going to teach them to Macintosh users because Macs are where these tools were first developed. And Mac users were not the dominant market share at the time. In fact, Apple had a low single-digit market share for the Mac. And it wasn't all Mac users she was targeting, just that small subset who wanted to learn graphic design skills. But once a foundation was in place, once she began teaching these students with this wonderful pedagogy she developed, she was able to grow from there. She wrote a book, she began doing workshops all over the world, and much more. So by 1996, she said she and her husband, Bruce Haven, had decided to move from where they were in Southern California in LA to an idyllic beach community called Ojai, California. Some of you may have been there. And they said, well, you know, if people will pay Linda to go fly to Peoria and deliver a workshop, maybe customers will pay to fly to Ojai. So they said, well, how could we test this idea and see if it might work out? Well, they borrowed the high school computer lab in Ojai on spring break in 1996. The workshop sold out in advance with people coming from as far away as Vienna. Proof of concept delivered. People will pay to fly to Ojai to take a course. Market risk for this new idea, now gone, right? ROI, was she thinking about ROI like we do in big companies? No, she wasn't thinking about ROI. Who cares about ROI? Is this thing going to work? Yeah, it's going to work. So by 1998, they found their own site in Ojai, and the Ojai Digital Arts Center was born. Well, then in September 2001, we all know what happened on that sad day. Disaster struck. Was anybody going to fly to Ojai to take a design course? Probably not. Was the dot-com bubble that had prevailed through the late 90s continuing? It was not. It was turning to dust, and people had been paying for Linda's courses with kind of what she called funny money from the dot-com boom. So the solution she and Bruce came up with, let's move our courses online. So in 2002, in 2001, growth flatlined, right? You know, the business fell off dramatically, but toward 2007, growth resumed.
Hey, Andy, I can't hear anything. Andy, is it on my side or on John's side? Andy, you there?
Just respond. John, can you get off camera and
back?
come back? There, you're back.
I'm back.
Oh, okay, you're back. Yes, all good.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened there, everybody, but I guess some sound got lost. So I was speaking about how Linda was funding this journey. Well, she funded it by getting the cash up front. So you think about the Ojai courses, they were all paid for in advance, sometimes a week, sometimes a month in advance. The online courses were paid via subscription, $25 a month, and you could take any course you want, anytime, as many courses as you want. And the instructors, of course, that she hired to deliver many of these courses were paid post-delivery. So there was always plenty of cash in the bank. She used that cash to grow the business. Effectively, what Linda built here was a customer-funded growth machine. Okay, so question for you. Was Linda knowingly breaking any of these conventional rules? What do you think? I don't think so. Linda was an art teacher. Her husband was an artist. They didn't know what these conventional rules were. They just instinctively went down the path, and when a door opened, they would walk through it. So let's talk about the rest of the lynda.com story. Well, by 2007, the business had become much more substantial, and Linda hired a new CEO. His name is Eric Robeson. He brought to the business 25 years of both tech and internet experience, something Linda and Bruce really lacked. And they together put the pedal to the metal, really started to grow the business. Okay, well, it turned into a rocket ship to the moon. By 2007, they were already at 100,000 subscribers when Robeson joined the business, and it had been bootstrapped, no outside capital, to 10 million in revenue. Well, 5 years later, 2012, they had 10x'd the business. Revenue hit 100 million. In 2013, finally, they took some outside investment from Axel and a couple of others in California, took on 103 million. And then in 2014, they took another round of capital to begin adding additional content to broaden out the learning portfolio. Well, in 2015, something interesting happened. LinkedIn came along and knocked on Linda's door and said, we'd like to buy your business, because what we want to do at LinkedIn is transition our business from how to get a job to how to get trained to accelerate your career or perhaps get that new job. So they bought lynda.com for $1.5 billion US. At the time, it had 83,000 videos. You could take any or all of those videos for $25 a month, and that was just a bit more than half of the revenue of the business. The other half of the revenue, the other 45% of the revenue, was corporates putting their people through lynda.com training. Companies like Apple and Adobe and many others were putting their people through in large batches. LinkedIn rebranded the business, LinkedIn Learning, so you won't find lynda.com today. And I think it's fair to say that lynda.com was EdTech before EdTech became cool. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions I want to ask of you before we finish. Number one, which of these 6 mindsets are already embodied in you today? Perhaps one or two of them are the way you think and act already. Question 2, which of these others could you learn? Are these things learnable? Yeah, I think they are. They're not rocket science, right? Anybody could learn to think and act in this entrepreneurial way. And number 3, are there some of these you could teach to your management team? I think so. And question 4, more pertinent to today, is there one of them that would help you overcome an obstacle that you are facing with an opportunity today? Okay, now, to make these mindsets yours, there's a really good new book. It's called Break the Rules. You can tell it's a really good book. My name's on the cover. The book is based on 20 years of in-depth case study research that I've conducted by the ringside seat that I've had, writing case studies on entrepreneurial businesses that I've used in my teaching. The book brings to life these mindsets that I said run counter to established best practices in big companies, perhaps companies like yours. They fly in the face of what we teach in B schools, like mine. Should this be mandatory reading for your innovation team? Well, maybe this might help them and your company break the logjam that sometimes gets in the way of innovation. So I convinced Wiley for this CDOIQ Symposium to give us a deal. So if you want to buy the book direct from Wiley, you don't pay the regular price of $29. You pay $20.30. The book will be shipped directly to you. You can order it online by going to the Wiley website. You have to click in, you look for the book, the title, Break the Rules, and you put the promo code when you order, CDO30. And between today and the end of the month, July 31st, you'll get 30% off. If you need bulk sales, if you want to get a bunch of books for your team, Laura Cooksley at Wiley would be happy to accommodate you, again, with a really good deal. Okay, so there you go. 6 counter-conventional, break the rules mindsets that can help anyone, maybe even you, change the world. Okay, I would be happy to take some questions here. I'm going to stop sharing these slides. If I can get my computer to turn them off, and let's get going with some Q&A, shall we? JP,
All right. Wow. Yeah.
we got some Q&A in the box.
Very interesting indeed. So we have a couple of questions on the Hoover platform. By the way, feel free to enter questions on the Q&A tab of Hoover. So one question is, what role does the emotional intelligence plays for an entrepreneur?
Jean-Pascal, that's a very good question. EQ is important in many walks of life, right? And I think a critical place where it comes to the fore for entrepreneurs is that entrepreneurs really need to understand the needs of their customers, the unsolved problems of their customers. I talked about problem first logic. Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman viscerally understood the needs of distance runners, elite distance runners, because they were such runners. But not always is an entrepreneur the customer, in a sense, like Knight was the customer. And so you've got to really understand your customer, and EQ is one really good way to gain that kind of understanding. Yeah, crucially important. Great question.
Okay. Another question we have here is, do you anticipate that broad adoption of historical data-trained AI will enhance or engineer out counter-conventional outputs? In other words, are we headed for AI-driven groupthink?
Good question. You know, we're so early in the AI journey here that we're all kind of speculating as to what's likely to happen here. I think almost by definition, based on the way AI works, AI is groupthink, right? AI takes data from the crowd and puts that data together. Are we headed there? Yeah, you know, we probably are. And I think what that's going to do is open opportunities for entrepreneurs to think differently, right? And thinking differently is one of the things that entrepreneurs do so well. I think, you know, AI may get big companies into a trap where they rely on it, and it's all historically driven. And you know, what entrepreneurs do well is look around the corner and see what's next. Steve Jobs was a master at that, right? Steve Jobs didn't do market research and ask people what they wanted. He said if Henry Ford had asked people what they wanted, they would have wanted a faster horse. That isn't how Steve Jobs works, and that's not how most entrepreneurs work.
Yeah, very good point. Another question from Ariel: how can one practice these mindsets? And I'm pretty sure you're going to say read the book.
Well, we can start there, but reading isn't doing, right?
Yeah.
So you know, there's a great book by Bob Sutton at Stanford that came out maybe a decade ago called The Knowing Doing Gap. You know, it's fine to know these things, but what we really have to do is get people to do these things. And so chapter 8 of the book actually is all about going from knowing to doing. Exactly what should you do now to put one or more of these mindsets into action. And I'd make a couple of comments about that. Number one, they're all kind of situational. You don't do them all the time every day in your work. But when a problem comes up or an opportunity to do something different for a customer, then yes, we may come into play, right? When there's an opportunity to do something that maybe isn't clear from a regulatory point of view, then not asking permission comes into play. So these things are like tools in your toolkit, when the right situation comes along, having and adopting these mindsets is what enables you to respond like an entrepreneur would respond.
There is another question on risk. I like the question. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. Entrepreneurs fail all the time.
They do.
And in fact, if we were going to look at statistics of new companies and startups and stuff, how many succeed over a long enough time period versus how many fail? Most of them fail.
Yeah.
What does that say about those 6 mindsets? Are there some that are more risky than others? Are there, maybe a 7th or an 8th that would be more in the area of mitigating things? Or is failure really necessary to learn and build on? Like, how do you look at that? Like the risk versus reward, given that statistically, most of them fail?
Yeah, great question. So I don't argue in the book that this is a foolproof way to make sure you succeed in every venture. That's not going to happen.
Right.
In fact, what these mindsets do for entrepreneurs, many of them, is do exactly what you just mentioned. They mitigate risk. So, for example, when you're thinking about doing something new and you think you need to invest to do that, well, instead of making that investment when it's risky, when there's uncertainty about market risk, about technology risk, about execution risk, go borrow the assets you need instead of investing in them, and don't make that investment until you've proven you've got proof of concept. So that mitigates risk. Problem first, not product first logic mitigates risk. Don't build a product and say, well, let's hope somebody's going to come and buy it. Start with a customer's problem. Again, that mitigates risk. So back to the participants' question here. Yeah, entrepreneurs are going to fail. Many ventures are going to fail. But I think what these mindsets do is enable the best entrepreneurs to be good managers of risk. When I talk to entrepreneurs I know, they don't view themselves, very interestingly, as risk takers. They view themselves as risk managers. They are very good at offloading risk, mitigating risk, finding a way to pass it off to somebody else, maybe an investor, maybe a customer. They don't want to take risks themselves. Not widely understood.
Interesting. So one question I have is what strikes me in the attitude of startups versus the attitude of big corporations, and I come from the big corporation world myself, is profitability is not a goal and can remain not a goal forever. How does that, and so having an unprofitable business is easier than having a profitable business. How does that play in these mindsets? How is it, like, first of all, do you confirm that indeed today, or maybe throughout the last few decades, entrepreneurship really doesn't consider profitability in their in what they are trying to do in those mindsets? Number one, and number two, is like how being unprofitable affects those mindsets that you have laid out.
Well, first of all, let's take note of the fact that it's only the very thin sliver of venture-backed companies that can run unprofitably for long periods of time. The fact is that the vast majority of firms, startups, young companies, never raise any venture capital. Years ago, when the Inc. 5000 list was 500, I did some research and studied the 500 people, 500 companies on that list in 1 year. And I asked myself, what percentage of those companies had raised any outside capital? You might be surprised to know that the answer was 6%. 94% raised no outside capital. And these were the 500 fastest growing companies in the US at the time. So most companies don't live in a negative cash flow, negative profit world. They ask for the cash and ride the float like Elon Musk does. They use, there's another book I've written, my previous book is called The Customer Funded Business. It turns out there are 5 different ways that you can get the customer to pay you in advance, like Musk does, like Michael Dell did. When Michael Dell was a 19-year-old freshman at the University of Texas selling PCs to small businesses, right? And he said, I'll sell you exactly the PC that you need to serve your business, but you have to pay me in advance. Well, with that money in advance, he bought the parts, hired his buddies to build the computers, and the rest is history. So entrepreneurs, most of them do not live in a negative cash flow world. And in fact, cash is the lifeblood of their businesses, and they know it. And by the way, cash is different from profit, right? You don't have to be profitable, but what you do have to have is cash in the bank, so you don't run out of it.
Yeah. Interesting. So another question I have, sort of personally coming from the big corporate world, is when I look at those and I am thinking like, could I do those things? It's not so much about learning them, it's unlearning everything else.
Yeah.
And so my question to you is, do you see people who have had careers in large corporations and after 20 years, 25 years, 30 years decide to be an entrepreneur and with like going with these mindsets?
Yeah, I'll give you a surprising data point. There are more founders funded in Silicon Valley over age 50 than there are under age 25, year in, year out. Does that come as a surprise? Big surprise, right? Yeah.
I mean, you come with the wisdom, right? I would say, like your gut feeling is probably more right than your gut feeling at 25-year-old. But I'm surprised to hear that. Okay, well, that's reassuring.
Yeah. So it's not too late. And again, we don't have to adopt all 6 of these mindsets on day one, because not all 6 are useful on a given day.
Yes.
But they are situational. And when the right situation comes along and you've got these mindsets in your head, you can say, an entrepreneur would do it this way. I'm going to say, yes, we can, or I'm not going to worry about that huge target market. I'm going to look for the little narrow one where I can meet their needs that nobody else can meet, because nobody's targeting that little target market like Phil Knight did.
Yeah. Okay, so these companies that you have chosen as examples to give some color on these mindsets, the Ubers and the Nikes of the world, right? They have become gigantic companies. Do you see in the transformation, from startup to what they are now, areas where those mindsets stopped working, where those mindsets had to be reversed, where how do those mindsets keep fueling the entrepreneurship when you are a 100 billion market cap company?
Yeah, that's really hard to do, of course. And one of the big challenges that every entrepreneur faces is, how do you keep the entrepreneurial culture with which you began the business alive as you get to 10 million in sales, 100 million in sales, a billion in sales? It's not easy to do. The best entrepreneurs, the Jeff Bezos, the Steve Jobs, the Michael Dells, have figured out how to build those cultures, how to build a culture where people can get on with their work. They don't have to ask permission to do anything, innovative. They develop procedures. There's a wonderful book that I came across doing the research for the business called Working Backwards.
Okay.
It's a book about Amazon, written by 2 guys who worked at Amazon, and it brings to life the obsession, the real obsession that Jeff Bezos had and still has for customers. And Bezos's whole idea at Amazon was, we're going to start with the customer, what the customer wants. That may be different than what the customer tells us they want, but we're going to start with what the customer needs, and we're going to work backwards from that to figure out what we need to do. And there's a half a chapter in the book about the development of the Kindle. So if you think about Amazon's origins, it was an e-commerce retailer, right? Basically selling books and CDs, and that's what they did, physically selling books and CDs. They built a highly sophisticated distribution system with warehouses, distribution centers linked closely with FedEx to keep costs down, and they had this beautiful system that was fantastic. And then Steve Jobs came along with the iTunes store, and all of a sudden Bezos said, you know what, our entire business is about to be digitally disrupted, because this physical distribution capability, this logistics capability that we've painstakingly built, is going to become irrelevant. So what did he do? He said, well, what's going to have to happen here, at least on the book side of the business, was that we're going to have to make digital books, you know, the reality. But there were no good e-readers at the time, Bezos thought. He said, we're going to have to build a better e-reader. Well, did Amazon have any capabilities to do hardware? None. You know, they'd never built any hardware. They were a retailer. But they assembled what Bezos calls a two-pizza team. A two-pizza team is a bunch of people who can sit around for lunch for a couple hours and be fed by two pizzas. And they got going on that. And the development of the Kindle transformed Amazon and put it in position to be what it is today. Well, that didn't happen on day one at Amazon. Amazon was already quite a good-sized company by the time that happened. So can this happen in big companies? Can they retain the culture? Yeah, they can, but only the best leaders are able to pull that off. Leaders like Bezos, leaders like Musk, leaders like Michael Dell and Steve Jobs. Those are the ones who enable their company. You know, what we all thought Apple was going to fall when Jobs died, right? Is it game over? You know, Apple's done. Well, what have we seen? You know,
that's right.
Yeah, remarkable.
Yeah.
It can be done. It's rarely done, but it can be done.
Do you see Uber and so going back to the two examples that you had, Uber and Nike, in that camp, or have they become much more conventional?
Certainly Nike is. Nike continues to innovate in many ways, including lots of digital innovations, by the way, that serve athletes in their various sporting categories very well. Uber, I'm not so sure. I'm not sure that the business model for Uber is actually going to work economically when the growth slows down, because at some point the growth is going to slow down. You can only penetrate so many cities, and once you're in all of them, the growth rate's going to be very modest. So I have my doubts about Uber, to be honest with you. We'll see.
Okay.
Time will tell. Yeah.
Right. In the never ask for permission, but do not break the law, you mentioned that there are some that do break the law. Do you have some examples?
Yeah, I tell a story in the book about a business in California called Josephine, and these two entrepreneurs had watched what Uber was doing and what Airbnb was doing, and they said, wouldn't it be great if we could get ethnic home prepared foods from this incredibly diverse community that is the San Francisco Bay Area, and get home cooked foods for dinner tomorrow night. And so they built a business to enable home cooks to be connected in a marketplace like way, just like Amazon, like Uber and Airbnb, connecting cooks with people who want an interesting meal. Well, that was all fine, except for one thing. It was illegal under the health and sanitation rules in California to sell home prepared foods other than in certain categories like granola and jams and things. You couldn't sell meat, you couldn't sell dairy. Wow. It was clearly illegal, and it's illegal in most states, probably in most countries. and they kind of ignored that small fact and said, well, we're going to hope we can change those rules. Well, they couldn't.
Oh.
Yeah, and they failed.
It started with good intentions and we're not careful. Yeah.
Well, we could call them good intentions, or we could call it naivete. One of the observers of that phenomenon at the time said, these guys think it's all wonderful, but what I'm worried about is some home cook going to Costco, buying a bunch of chicken. They get home, leave it on the kitchen counter for an hour because their kids are screaming, and who knows what happens to that chicken by the time that chicken is served.
Yeah.
We can't guarantee the consumer is going to have a safe experience eating that kind of food. Sorry, guys, not going to work.
Yeah. No, the spirit of such a law makes total sense. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left. Can you tell us about the book? Like, why did you decide to write the Break the Rules book now?
Yeah, it's my wife's answer to your question, JP, was that John needed a project.
Okay.
And so maybe there's a little bit of truth to that, but I think more fundamentally, as I've observed what's happened in the world over the last decade or so, the world needs jobs in every country. Doesn't matter where you look, we need jobs to put people to work. And those jobs today are created by fast-growing companies. So big multinationals don't create jobs. In fact, they try and replace jobs with capital, right? Let's get rid of those unpredictable humans and let a machine do that. And startups don't create the jobs either, because for every startup that's coming into business today, there's another one down the street that's failing, given the high failure rate. It's those that become fast-growing gazelles, as we call them, that create all the new jobs. So I've been thinking about that for a long time. And I said to myself a couple of years ago, there was a lot of research in the world of entrepreneurship when entrepreneurship first got onto the radar of academia. This is now 30 some years ago. Research trying to understand what the differences were between these creatures called entrepreneurs and other successful business people.
Mm-hmm.
And the sum total of all of that research was, we can't find any differences.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for every swashbuckling entrepreneur like extrovert like Richard Branson in the UK, there's an introvert like Michael Dell. For every high-tech PhD entrepreneur like Sergey Brin at Google, there's Hamzi Ukalaya building a business called Chobani Yogurt, an immigrant who came across from Turkey. They just couldn't find any differences. And yet, I said to myself a couple of years ago, I've been in classrooms with a couple of thousand entrepreneurs over the last 20 years. I've written 50 case studies on entrepreneurs. I know there are differences. Perhaps I can figure out what those differences really are. Why don't I go back and look at this body of work I've done at LBS over 20 years and see if I can identify what these differences are. So I did that. I looked back to my body of work. I interviewed entrepreneurs. I read about people like Bezos and Musk and others. And I said, okay, I think I found the differences. It's not in their passion. It's not in their personality. It's here. It's in their mindsets. And it's these 6 mindsets, not 7, not 8. It's these 6 mindsets that drive them.
All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing these incredible insights. I'm certainly going to buy the book now and read it because it sounds really fascinating. So thank you so much, John.
Thank you, JP.
Thank you, and thanks everyone in the audience. And stay tuned for the next session. I think in half an hour. Thanks.